Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Thursday, May 29th, 2025, episode 400, and we're going to talk about change, right? Well, so why? Because I was voted to give the moving up or change of building or graduation speech for the middle school. My dad would always say, never turn down the chance to say something, to educate, or to raise the bar. So I thought about what I would say at a kind of a commencement. I've thought about this before for a seminary, but for a middle school, it's going to be a little bit different, right? Like, so you can't, right? It's for middle schoolers, not for seminary students, and so which is grad school, right? So I had to try to figure out, okay, what would I say to people who are going to go either to a different school next year because the middle school is closing down, and that's why I had to go look for another job. And but anyway, and then so to those kids and to their parents, and I thought, well, why not talk about change? Because that's life all the time, not just for middle schoolers, but for their parents as well. Because as the middle schoolers are growing up, so their parents are changing as well, the things that they need to do for their kids. And in addition to the fact that their lives, their health, everything is changing as well. And we live in a society where there is so much change, especially with a different president in charge with seemingly no consistent direction on anything. And if you listen to the judge today, Judge Napolitano, then you know that some people are thinking that some of his staff or people in the Pentagon are making decisions behind his back. You know, just sort of like the way General Milley did it towards the end of the first Trump term, where he called up China behind the back of the president and said, you know, I would never have done something if he had ordered it. You know, it's just some goofy thing like that. Anyway, I'm surprised that Trump doesn't remember any of that and is not going to do anything about it. So it's just strange because they're still working against him behind his back. Anyway, so I thought change would be an appropriate topic. And my wife laughs at me because she doesn't think that I'll be able to keep within the time. But I have time to practice to talk as fast as possible to get as much information in as possible. But I thought I'd sort of brainstorm a bunch of things in this episode and then cut it down for the delivery next week. So we're always going through change, right? Middle schoolers, they're going to go through a change of school, change of grade. Their age is always changing. Their maturity is changing. School rules change. The subject of study changes. Family dynamics change. Friends change. Teachers change. And then comes college and everything changes again. And then you finish college, et cetera, et cetera. The only constant in life is change, so they say. Now, you can fight that, but things will always change, right? Every day we get older, for example. I've talked about change before, but here I'm just focusing on the topic itself. You know, so at some point we might find a comfort zone, like, oh, this is nice. Let's just keep it like this, right? I don't want anything to change. So maybe it's being single, right? A point in your single life where you're like, this is perfect, can't get any better than this. Or maybe it's that feeling of falling in love. You don't want that to change. Maybe it's your job, your health, your neighborhood. Maybe you're an empty nester now and you just want that feeling to last. But when you get comfortable, that's when you start putting yourself in a box. Then you don't want things to change anymore at all. And eventually you get stuck, right? Because you're enjoying that moment, that sort of situation, which is really only an instant. you like it so much that you want to keep it that way. And so you start building walls around yourself to try to maintain it for as long as possible. And it doesn't matter how radical you were when you were younger. Most people eventually, when they find that sweet spot in life, they become a conservative, right? They think that even if their beliefs haven't changed, right? So I've mentioned it before, in that episode where I say, how did I become the hippie, right? Uh, so people might think that because they were radical in the 60s and they still hold the same beliefs, that those beliefs are still radical today, and that might not actually be the case. In fact, more likely, it is definitely not the case, right? The radicals of the 60s are now contemporary conservatives, right? They just look at the Democrats. They're as conservative as the Republicans. And keep in mind, I'll just take a pause here and remind you what a conservative is. A conservative is someone who rejects change, someone who doesn't want things to change. Now, you can narrowly define theological conservative, religious conservative, political conservative, construction conservative, manufacturing conservative. It doesn't matter. Anything a situation where you don't want things to change, it makes you a conservative. A liberal, in contrast, is someone who embraces change and looks for change always, right? And that's a liberal, broadly speaking, right? So no matter how much of a radical you were when you were younger, when you find that sweet spot where you're just like, oh yeah, life, it doesn't get any better than this, right? Yeah, that's when you start becoming a conservative, you start putting up walls, you put yourself in a box. But then comes along that monster, change, right? Change is the monster, which forces us out of our box, forces us out of our comfort zone. Are you ready? Did you prepare? Did you know it was coming? Do you have the tools to be able to adapt, roll with the changes? If you listen to my sermons, you know that I'm all about learning and growing more all the time because life doesn't stand still. And so you have to be flexible and roll with the changes. If your knowledge becomes stagnant, right? You're like, no, I'm smart right now. I'm on top of my field right now. And you don't continue to learn and push, not just in your own field, but in your life, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of the stereotype of the absent-minded professor. Why are they absent-minded? Because that's all they think about is their focus of study. They don't think about anything else. They don't even learn how to balance their checkbook, right? And as long as someone else is willing to do it for them, they never bother to learn, right? They get to obsess about that narrow topic, subject, that no one else can come close to understanding, right? But they lag so far behind in every other aspect of their life. And unless they are surrounded by people who are extremely tolerant, or because you are so wealthy and successful and famous that other people are willing to sacrifice a normal relationship so they can have some of your cheddar, right? So they can have some a little, derive benefit from all the fame and fortune that you have. Most people would not be willing to stay in a situation like that, stay in a relationship or a family like that. So change creates challenges or problems, right? And there are always problems in life. And remember what I always say, what is a problem? A problem is just simply the signal that you've reached the end of your knowledge. You got to learn more. But how, right? You're in a box, which means you got to get out somehow, right? So you're all comfortable. The world has gone and changed on you. So now you realize you're out of touch. You don't really know what's going on. The world doesn't look like it did when you started building your box. And so now you got to get back in the game. This is why education is so important, not the information itself, right? I mean, everyone remembers that uh, every higher level of education, they tell you that everything that you learned before is was wrong, and so now you're going to learn the right information, the correct information, every level. I remember in science, or at least when I went from high school to college, that's all they ever said was, yeah, that's what you learned in high school, but now you're going to learn the real stuff. And then I went to grad school, they said the same thing. And so it's not the information itself, but it's learning how to get more information, how to critique the information you already have, to critique the information that you encounter as you move along. At the same time, you have to recognize your bias, right? What is my own personal bias? What do I prefer? What do I reject? What are my sacred cows? Pardon me if you're Hindu, but what are your sacred cows? What are the things that you are going to protect? Maybe this is what education used to be, critical thinking, not in the Marxist sense, but in the an analytical sense. I talked about this before, where in my university, where they say we're now going to teach critical thinking, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome because that's what I do all the time. And everyone would always give me this sideways look, and I was like, what do you talk? What? I'm teaching critical thinking, and it turns out. What I was teaching was actual critical thinking, but what they meant was Marxism, right? That apparently is critical thinking, which it's not, right? But anyway, uh, that's probably what education used to be, uh, analyzing, critiquing, right? Not indoctrination, right? Which is what it is now. And the secondary level and the university level, it's all indoctrination. But this is one way of getting out of the box, out of your box. You lack information, right? You've built walls around yourself to protect you from new information, but now you got to get more information. How do you get more information? Especially when you have when you don't really know how to critique and judge, or you have to critique and judge information to know what's good and what is not, right? So which direction are you going to go? What information is destructive, right? You have to be able to know so that you can make better choices. The moment we start preventing change, remember, we're the conservatives. That's when you start protecting your bias, right? So the idea is you have to get more information, right? But if you are protecting your bias, right or wrong, you're a conservative, and there is a lot of potential danger there, right? In other words, you could make it such that you can never resolve your problem. So if you're in that situation where you're like, well, yeah, I get it, but there's no way I'm going to touch this bias. It's just too important to me, whatever it is, right? For me, it'd be like Jesus. And for some people, it's climate change. For some people, other people, it's political power, whatever. There's something that you cannot let go. All right, that's fine. You have to find another wall to break through, right? You're not going to do it through knowledge, right? Information, so you're going to have to do it another way. Uh, but this is the easiest wall, right? You have to accept, be willing to accept the possibility that your bias is wrong. So the longer we maintain our bias, the longer we don't test our bias, then the greater the risk that our bias is leading us in a wrong direction. People are often liberals when they're younger. And so when you're younger, you don't have any power, you have no money. People are always ordering you around, shoving you around. So you can't wait till you get older. You can't wait till you get bigger, stronger. You want to be independent. You want to be able to be the one in charge. Like, I want to be able to call the shots. I want to be able to make the decisions, not have to go where other people decide to go. But what comes with that is responsibility. Yes, yes, I know, Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. It's from a comic book, but it is still true. You have to be able to accept the consequences of the choices that you make. And as you get older, you realize that the choices that we make, they're big choices. And sometimes the cost, the consequences are enormous, which forces us to be more careful, which means we need more information, better information, and we can never stop, right? And so going to school is learning how to get better, more and better information, right? We need knowledge to make the best choices possible. And that's what I always try to teach. I downplay facts, right? Because facts are subjective, right? They're only facts until someone comes along and says, nah, there's some better information. And religious freakazoids like myself, we will say that there are certain things that are absolute. That's fine. But it's always the interpretation then that you have to deal with. And so this is what I try to teach them, right? There are certain names you got to remember. There are certain concepts you got to know. You should know the continents, for example. But they probably won't remember most of the information that that crazy Korean teacher they had in middle school was trying to get them to memorize. But I do hope they remember not to be afraid to grow, to stretch out, to learn and gain more knowledge. More knowledge to be ever more creative, to innovate their way out of problems, to discover things that other people haven't figured out yet, right? That's the benefit of knowing how to get better information. Sometimes you make a choice and you go to a place and start learning, gaining information in an area that no one else ever thought, right? And that be the foundation for a doctoral dissertation. But if you remember, and let's just say you don't, you're just like, I'm not going to go to grad school. That's fine, right? Be poor the rest of your life, be a university professor. I get it. Not a bad choice. But if you know how to do so, like you've mastered that ability to be able to get more information, like you do it as a habit, uh, without even thinking, that's what you do. You shift your perspective and you say, oh, I am being impeded here somehow. I have a problem. You just shift your perspective a little bit and it ceases to be a problem, right? Problems then only last as long as it takes for you to find a solution. And sometimes it's only for a moment. And eventually you move ahead of the people who are smarter, faster, stronger than you were when you were younger, but they decided to stay in their box, right? Just like the guy I was talking about yesterday, he still is hands down way smarter than me, but he put himself in a box. And so even though I am not as, my brain is not as powerful as his, I keep moving, right? I keep moving ahead. I keep pushing against the walls of my own personal box to the point where I don't even really see the box any longer, right? The possibility, the potential of something new and great in our future is always the hope and expectation. And that's hopefully what I'll be able to convey and uh, tell all of our so-called graduates and their parents that even them, right, the parents too, that they shouldn't stop learning. They shouldn't stop pushing up against the walls of their box to continue to uh, have expectation and hope of something better. And religiously speaking, it is a Christian school. I'll say that ultimately, by faith, right, whatever your religion is, whatever that ultimate, the pinnacle, the goal of what it is that you live for, that is what you achieve. And hopefully, it will be this speech will be well received. Who knows? Obviously, I won't have 20 minutes to say it. I'll only have half of this time, if that. But hopefully, I'll be able to figure out how to say it, what to say, and that it would resonate with everybody, and everyone will be inspired to go out there and be filled with hope and expectation. That's it for this episode. I'll talk to you next time.